Hello everybody, I am Mark Carter with Midwest Astro and thanks for joining today. Today we are going to do a special on AstroPixelProcessor and how is it used for stacking your images and calibrating your images. I use it just for that. I do not use it for post-processing. I will then take my data from AstroPixelProcessor and move it into Photoshop and PixInsight for the rest of that. So stick with us and I'm going to show you how this works. So our first screen that loads up is we need to pick a working directory. So what does that actually mean? This is the screen where we have to say where we want these files to all be saved. So in this case, I'm going to go to AstroPixelProcessor and I'm going to put in today's date. I already did that. So I'll pick this folder here. So again, this is the folder where we're actually going to be saving our images to. That way we can later retrieve them. So I'm going to go ahead and say open. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen is where we're primarily going to be focused. You can see that we default to tab 1. On tab 1, this is where we're going to start defining our stuff. I'm picking the sunflower galaxy, and I'm only going to do some of my data, that way it doesn't take too long. But I'm going to call this sunflower. You can also call it M63, whatever you want to call it. This is what your file names will come out as later on. So now I'm going to go to my lights. So I know by looking ahead of time, I'm going to pick night 3 because that has a mix of all LRGB. On this screen here, you can manually assign your light frames to a channel here. It will automatically pick that up. And if you're using one-shot color, you can use L Pro or L Enhance when you go to do your data. That way you can put L Pro data together or L Enhance, and then you can mix them later on. So I'm going to go ahead and just say OK here. And I'm only going to do one session, but if you shoot multiple nights worth of data, which in this case I've got 6 nights worth of data so far, and I'll probably do as much as 10 nights worth of data, I can then put my night 1 lights into a session 1, for example, or I can name it night 1, and then what I can do is I can accurately assign those flats directly to those lights, because after every single LRGB session I personally shoot new flats, because you might have new dust, you might have something that came in the way that you need to have filtered out, and other nights you may no longer have dust. So if you're using flats from say night 1, but on night 10 that dust no longer is on your lens, you could actually harm your image by trying to calibrate something out that no longer exists in there. You may not have that donut anymore, so you might actually create a donut. So with that, again, I can appropriately assign my lights to my flats. So I'm going to just go ahead and say OK for this one because I'm only doing one session. You'll see over here it loaded all my lights, so we can check down here to our files here. Let me pull this up just a little bit. We have blue, we have green, we have luminance, and we have red. There's not many files for each, but that's fine because we don't want to spend too much time going over this. So now I'm going to go ahead and load my flats. So I'm going to go back to my calibrations folder. I'm going to go to night 3, and I'm going to pick all of our non-dark flats, so just regular flats. I'm going to say open. I'm going to leave this as is. Again, the fits file has that in there. And because we're only using one session, I'm going to leave it on only one session. But if we had multiple nights, again, I would pick whatever session I wanted to assign these to. That way only that night gets these particular files. Then I'm going to grab our dark flats. That way they properly work with the flats. We're going to say open. On this one, leave it as default. All channels is what you want. You don't want to go assign them to individual filters. They'll figure it out on their own because they basically act like darks. You still need darks too, but these will behave in a similar fashion. Again, only one session, so we'll say OK. Then over here, I'm going to go to my darks, and I'm going to go back a few levels to my darks. I know I did bin 1, I have gain of 100, and with the ASI 2600mm, because it doesn't have amp glow, I use the same darks for no matter what temperature or duration. In this case, these are 300-second darks, and I've used them for as much as 1200-second light exposures. I'm not worried about having a darks library for all different temperatures and all different durations, but if you use something like the ASI 294mm, you will need a library of darks for specific temperatures. Usually what I would do is do 0, -5, and -10, and then I would stick to those all year, and then I would try to be consistent with my lights with about 180 seconds for LRGB and 300 seconds for SHO, because you have to take so many darks, you're spending so much time shooting them, it's easier just to work out of a library at that point. So with this though, I am fortunate enough to not have to worry about that. I just use these same 5 darks. So I'll go ahead and say open. We'll leave on all channels for darks all the time. And then again, if we were shooting multiple nights, I would pick all sessions because I want it to apply to all of those. But in this case, we're only shooting one session. We'll leave it as is. So we'll say okay here. So now that those are loaded, I'm going to go to tab 0 really quick and just hit. If you're using a one-shot color camera, over here on the pattern, you need to change supported to RGGB, most likely. You need to confirm what Bayer matrix your camera uses, but if you use something like the ZWO ASI 294MC or the 2600MC, you're going to be using RGGB for 4 squares per pixel of red, 2 greens, and 1 blue. After you've done that, you'll also want to select this option here of Force Bayer. That way when your image comes out, it is RGB. It's not a monochrome image. For the sake of using monochrome data though, you're just going to leave this tab as is. You're not going to touch it. We're going to come over here back to 1, and we're just going to see, do I need to pick anything else? Nope. Calibrate, I do not change anything in here. If you want to know what some of these things do, as you can see, you can hover over them and you can get an explanation of what that will do. I don't change anything in here. You do have the option to do this remove light pollution. It adds a lot of time to the stacking process, and I find that it's probably not as beneficial to do it. You can actually clean up a lot of your light pollution in post-processing with those worries. So I don't personally do this just to add time to stacking, and I may not even like what it does. Analyze stars with galaxies, I usually leave it right about here at this 500 mark. I don't usually change this all that much, but if I'm doing nebulas, I might bump this up to 1,000. And where this will really come into play big time for you is going to be when you're shooting mosaics. If you're doing mosaics, you want to make sure you have a lot of star pairings, and you want to make sure that this is properly analyzing those stars to make those pairings. Then the next thing here is tab 4 to register. You can manually set your reference, or it can automatically do it for you. I haven't seen any need of why I would need to do that manually, and I'm pretty happy with what it selects on its own. If you're looking at changing these, I would just leave everything pretty much as is. If you know you have a lot of star pairings with nebulas, you might bump it up to pentagons if there's a lot. I probably would not touch this in most cases. Scale start and stops, mosaics will be really where you're going to use this, so we're going to leave this as is. If you're shooting over multiple nights with different scopes, you might consider using this dynamic distortion correction. At the same time, if you do use the same camera and optics, you can definitely use this checkbox, leave it as is. But if you're shooting over multiple nights with different scopes, different cameras, definitely unselect this. I don't change anything that's down here. If we go to normalize, you'll go to advanced only if you're using mosaics. On integrate, in most cases, I'll only save about 85, maybe 80% of my actual light frames. And a lot of that's going to be is not every frame is as good as it maybe looks when you analyze them. With integrate, if you're not sure what to pick, you can leave it as automatic and it will do everything for you. Or if you have an idea of what you want to select, you can do that too. I usually use average because I have more than 20 frames, but in this case I could use median. And then the weights, I usually just leave it as quality. But again, if you don't want to get too far into that, you can leave it as automatic, which I'm gonna actually go ahead and do here. If you want to set your Wizard rejection or your Sigma rejection, you can do that here as well. And if again you hover over this, it'll always give you the tooltip of what to select when and why. We'll leave it as is. The composition, I'm gonna leave it as full, but if you only want the final image for all of these to match your reference image, you can do that. I usually use it as full, and I will crop it later on my own. If you're doing multiple nights, it is recommended to go ahead and pick local normalization correction. I typically tend not to, just because this can add a lot of time, but also it depends on how many nights you're shooting. If you're shooting a lot of nights apart, it might actually be best to at least use 1 in 1. And that way you get a little bit of normalization between your frames, and that way you don't get some wonky looking backgrounds when you are doing your image. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to say no LNC, because it does add a substantial amount of time when it comes to stacking your images. So I will go ahead and turn on this multi-band blending, and a lot of it's just because you're going to have overlap between frames, so I always bump it up to about 9 or 10, and that's usually about it. I pretty much leave everything else. From here, I'm going to say integrate, and then I'm just going to say okay, and then I will check back. Alright, and welcome back, everybody. So we have run everything, and we are now looking at the final product. So when you look at this particular image, you'll see that you get 4 that come out. If we look specifically here, we have a blue, green, luminance, and red. We can click and we can see each particular file. We can zoom in. In this case, you can see a satellite didn't properly get removed. That's where you're also going to need to kind of play with the settings a little bit and see what clipping you might need. You might need Wizard clipping. There's also an adaptive clipping in there, maybe Sigma. You might have to run this a couple times until you find what works best for your specific data. So with this, what you can do now is you can take this and you can begin to manipulate it. You can also, inside of AstroPixelProcessor, do the processing itself. Again, I've never done it, so I'm not going to advise you on how to do it. So I will actually be making a video eventually on how do I get started with galaxies and nebulae when I do PixInsight. So stay tuned. Be sure to smash that thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. I will be releasing much more, and especially a focus on processing, as that seems to be my #1 request for these particular videos. So I will try to do everything I can. What I can tell you is when you use PixInsight, sometimes people don't know all of the tools or really how they work. I highly recommend this book. I have no reason to tell you that you should get this book other than the fact it is worth every single penny. Warren Keller and his team that worked together on this book have gone through extensive details. They've even gone as far as showing you how to use specific programs, what settings to use. And then my favorite part, he has actually gone out of his way to give you checklists and tell you what you should be doing and in what order. And then if you don't know what those include, and begin looking through to find how to do those particular steps. Highly recommend this book. I've read it multiple times and I'm still using techniques from it. So with that, everybody, clear skies, and until next time, take care of yourself.